The schedule was still folded in his fist when I found him. Orvik Tan had been dead for somewhere between 2 and 4 hours. The Arvin masts, environmental systems had been cycling erratically since day 19, so body temperature gave me a range, not a number. He was slumped at the watch station on the forward observation deck, back against the console, one hand flat on his knee and the other, closed around a small rectangle of survey paper that I wouldn't have noticed if the light from the pellucid drift hadn't been coming in at a low angle through the portside glass and catching the white corner of it between his thumb and first finger. I crouched beside him and stayed there for a moment, not touching anything. The observation deck had been Tan's preferred station for the last 11 Mala days. He'd claimed it on day 8. After Sarath Yol had stopped being able to tolerate the ambient resonance that the Sarath generated in the lower corridor sections, and someone had needed to take the forward watch. Tan had simply said he'd do it. He said it the way he said most things, flatly, without negotiation, as if the matter had already been decided somewhere before he'd opened his mouth. I reached over and opened his hand. His fingers were still supple enough to move, which meant the lower range of the window was probably right. 2 hours, maybe a little more. The paper unfolded on its own. Once I released the pressure of his grip, it had been folded and refolded so many times along the same creases that it knew its own shape. 4 panels, each one covered in small handwriting in blue survey pencil, the kind that doesn't smear in high humidity environments and doesn't fade under the electromagnetic wash that the drift corridor had been throwing since we'd crossed the first marker buoy on day 1. I read it once fast, then I sat down on the deck beside him and read it again. The Sarath had been with us for 23 days by then. I should explain what that means, for anyone who wasn't on the Arvin mast, because the official mission logs don't capture it correctly. The logs describe a distributed electromagnetic entity of indeterminate age, origin unknown, occupying a 3,000-kilometer corridor through the pellucid drift. They describe sensor interference, hull resonance, anomalous crew biometric readings. They describe the entity as non-hostile, which is technically accurate in the narrowest possible sense, meaning it never deployed anything that registered as a weapon and ever attempted direct physical contact with the vessel or any crew member. What the logs don't describe is what it felt like to be inside that corridor, with it for 23 days. The Sarath did not attack. It was far too old and far too patient for anything as crude as an attack. What it did was occupy. It occupied the electromagnetic spectrum around the Arvin mast so completely that our communications array had gone dark on day 4. Our long-range navigation had been unreliable since day 6, and our drive calibration had degraded to the point where, by day 14, we could make short orbital corrections, but not the sustained burn we'd need to exit the drift's gravity gradient. It occupied the acoustic range of the lower corridors with a subsonic resonance that didn't register on instruments, but that every crew member felt in their sternum after 3 days of continuous exposure. A pressure, not quite sound, like a word being said just below the threshold of meaning. And it occupied the psychological space around a crew of 6 people who had been told by mission briefing that transit through the pellucid drift take 8 days. We were on day 23. We had provisions for 32. I want to be specific about what the first 23 days cost us, because the survey board summaries reduce it to biometric shorthand and sleep deprivation graphs, and that misses the thing itself. The Sarath's resonance was not a threat you could see coming, it was ambient. It was continuous. It was a frequency that your nervous system registered as urgency, not the sharp urgency of visible danger, which your body knows how to process, but a low, constant urgency that had nowhere to land. Your hand stayed slightly tense. Your sleep, when you got it, shallow and full of events you couldn't name when you woke. You ate because you'd scheduled yourself to eat, not because hunger felt normal. And every 6 hours you put on your headset, sat down at the watch station, and tried to read sensor data accurately while the Sarath hummed through the hull of the ship, and the light of the pellucid drift came in through whatever port was facing the right direction, and the rest of the crew slept 2 compartments away. After 3 weeks of that, People change in small ways that are hard to track until you compare the crew manifest from day 1 to what you're looking at on day 23. Sarat Yol had stopped being able to process the resonance on day 11. There was no sharp incident. He hadn't broken down or done anything dangerous. He'd simply stopped being able to function inside the forward sections of the ship. His response times in watch drills had been degrading steadily since day 8, and on day 11, Tan had documented an anomaly that Yol had been stationed to log and had failed to log, not because he'd been asleep, but because he'd looked at the sensor reading, and it hadn't resolved into information for him. He'd watched it for 4 minutes and then logged nothing. When we reviewed the footage in debrief, his eyes were open and tracking, and he simply wasn't processing what they were showing him. We had moved him to the environmental compartment after that, and reduced his watch hours and told him to rest, and he'd improved slightly but never fully come back. Docent Iris Cahen, our science officer, had gone the other direction. She'd narrowed. Day 1 Cahen was the person on the crew most likely to ask 3 questions in a row about sensor data that everyone else had already accepted and moved on from. By day 15, she'd stopped asking questions that didn't directly bear on the drive window calculation she was building. She ate at her station. She slept in 4-hour blocks timed to her analysis schedule. She was doing her job with extraordinary precision and had essentially stopped doing anything else. I didn't consider that a problem at the time. Considered it an adaptation. Looking back, I think it was her version of the same pressure the rest of us were managing. She'd found the only thing that still had clear edges, and she'd put all of herself inside it. Engineering specialist Fosa had started talking to the hull, continuously, and not in a way that would have alarmed anyone in isolation. But by day 18, if you walked by the drive compartment between 2 and 4 in the morning, you'd hear him having low, even conversations with the ship, in a tone that was exactly the tone he used when he was walking a new technician through a calibration procedure. Explaining things, patient, specific, unhurried. I asked him about it once, near the end, and he said he didn't know he was doing it, but that it felt right. I believed him. The Arvin mast was the only thing that hadn't changed under the resonance, and he was an engineer, and I think some part of him had decided the hull deserved the same attention as the crew. Pren Malo had gone quiet, not Yol quiet, where the silence had a quality of absence to it. Malo's quiet was a different thing, more like an intake of breath that had been held for a very long time. He watched the watch station with a particular focused attention during the transitions when one person handed off to the next, as if he were cataloging something. He did his shifts. He ate. He slept. But he had a look in the second half of the mission, especially in the early mornings, of someone who was holding something in their hands very carefully. And Tan. Tan had not changed in any way I could see, which was the thing about Tan that I've thought about more than anything else in the years since. 23 days inside the Sarath's corridor, 6 people deteriorating in different directions, and the ship systems coming apart one by one, and the provisions window narrowing from either end. And Tan had gone to his watches and updated his schedule and said what needed to be said when he had something to say, and I had not, in those 23 days, been able to identify a single moment where he seemed to be spending anything he didn't have. That's not the same as calm. I want to be precise about this because the word calm gets used about people in those situations as a kind of catch-all that doesn't quite fit. Calm implies ease or absence of weight. Tan wasn't easy. He was carrying something. Could feel it in the way he moved through the ship. In the way he'd pause in the hatchway between the forward section and the middeck for one breath before entering a room, in the way he held his survey pencil when he was updating the schedule, in the deliberate economy with which he chose his words. He wasn't calm, he was something else. He was holding the weight of it and not putting it down, and you could tell the difference if you'd spent enough time near people in that kind of situation to recognize the distinction. I have spent enough time near people in that kind of situation. I've been doing survey work for 21 years, and I know the difference between someone who's managing and someone who's decided. Tan had decided something on day 8, when he'd taken over the forward watch and started the schedule. I hadn't known then what he'd decided. I know now. I reached into my breast pocket and folded the paper smaller and stood up. The Sereth's resonance was a little lower than it had been the previous morning. I'd been tracking it by feel for 2 weeks, the way you track air pressure when you've grown up in a climate where the weather changes fast. It wasn't a significant drop. It might have been nothing. I noticed it and I held it in my head alongside everything else as I walked back through the hatchway to wake the crew. There were 5 of us left: myself, Pren Malo, docent Yuris Kayan, engineering specialist Fosa, and Sarat Yol, who'd been sleeping in the environmental compartment for the better part of the last 4 days, and who hadn't spoken more than 3 consecutive sentences to anyone since day 17. Malo had been Tana's closest thing to a friend on board, in the way that 2 taciturn people who respect each other's silence can be friends. They didn't talk much, but in the second week's of the mission they'd started thinking these meals at the same time, without coordinating it, and I'd come into the galley more than once to find them sitting across from each other, eating without saying anything in a way that was companionable rather than empty. Kahan was our science officer, the one who'd been tasked with documenting the Sereth encounter. She'd been doing her job with a kind of hollow determination that I found both admirable and a little frightening. Every interaction logged, every sensor anomaly annotated, every frequency shift recorded in the margin of her analysis notebook, with the time in her own biometric reading at the moment of occurrence, because she'd decided early on that the subjective physical response to the Sereth was data too, and she wasn't going to discard it because it was uncomfortable to include. Fosa had stopped sleeping in regular intervals around day 12 and had started catnapping in 90-minute increments, always near the drive compartment, always with one hand resting on the hull, like he was feeling for vibrations. He'd told me on day 15 that the hull had a particular resonance pattern in the hours when the Sereth's output was highest, and that he could read the Sereth's activity better through his hand than through the sensors, which were subject to calibration drift. I'd logged that observation and not known what to do with it. It had turned out by day 20 that he was correct. I woke them in order of proximity. Malo first, then Fosa, then Kayan, and finally Yol, who took longer to surface than the others and who, when he finally opened his eyes, looked at my face and said, "Tan," not as a question. I said yes. We gathered in the mid-deck galley, the one space on the vessel that the Sereth's subsonic in resonance reached least clearly, something about the water recycling tanks in the adjacent compartment acting as a partial damper. Kahan had worked that out on day 9, measuring the resonance output at different points in the ship against her own subjective experience of the pressure it generated, and had presented it at the daily brief, with a diagram and 3 supporting data points. We'd been holding all crew meetings there since. We sat around the table with cups of processed caffeine, none of us drinking it, and I told them what I'd found. I didn't mention the paper yet. I'm not sure why I waited. Partly it felt like it needed context that I didn't have yet. I'd read it twice, but I hadn't finished thinking about it, and the kind of thing it was seemed to require that I understand it before I showed it to people who'd known him better than I had. Partly it felt like something that belonged to me for a little while longer, before it belonged to everyone. I'd found it. I'd opened his hand. I'd read it in the light from the drift coming through the portside glass. And whatever that moment was, it hadn't finished being mine yet. "Cause?" Malo asked. "Heart," I said. Kahan can confirm when she's had time to look at him, but from presentation, cardiac event. Stress-induced most likely. I paused. He was at the watch station. Sitting down, he didn't call out. None of them said anything for a moment. The water tanks in the adjacent compartment made their low cycling noise. Somewhere in the structure of the ship, very far below the range of a standard audiometer, the Sereth did whatever the Sereth did in the hours when it wasn't doing anything in particular. Couldn't hear it. You felt it in the spaces between heartbeats, a half-second shimmer in the rhythm that your body had stopped flagging as abnormal because it had been there long enough to feel like the baseline. "How long can we hold the forward watch without him?" Fosa asked. Tickle. He meant it practically. We all understood that, and none of us took it as callousness. In a situation like ours, the practical question is also the way you say, "I know what this means, and I'm still here." That's what we need to talk about, I said. We'd been running two-person watches since day 11. Tana's recommendation, after y'all had been pulled from the rotation, 2 people at the forward station through each 6-hour block, 1 actively monitoring the sensor array, and 1 secondarily watching, so that if the primary monitor's attention degraded, there was a fallback. It had added to the rotation burden, but it had also caught 4 anomalies in the 2nd and 3rd weeks that a solo watch would likely have missed. We'd flagged those anomalies as significant in the logs. I still think they were. I still think the Seraph was doing something with them that we didn't fully understand. With Tan gone, we were at 4 people capable of sustained watch duty. Yol was borderline, present in body, functional in a narrow range, but his response times had been degrading since day 11, and I was not willing to put him on a critical watch block alone. That left 3 reliable, 1 marginal. The schedule Tan had been running assumed 5. We needed to rebuild it on the fly, to the inside of a situation that had already cost us 1 person, and that was showing no signs of resolving. We still have 9 days of provisions,
Kahan said.
She said it as information, not as comfort, which was characteristic of her by that point in the mission. She'd stopped offering things as comfort around day 16. She offered them as data. 8.5, Fossa corrected, not unkindly. The reclamation efficiency on the protein stores has been running about 6% below spec since the resonance started affecting the processing unit temperature. I've been compensating but not fully recovering. If the drive holds for a short burn on day 26, Kahan continued, we may be able to gain enough momentum to begin the exit gradient. The window I've calculated is narrow, 14 hours of optimal corridor alignment. If we miss it or if the Seraph shifts the resonance pattern again, the next window is day 31. No one said what day 31 meant in terms of the provisions calculation. We were all doing it in our heads. It won't shift, Malo said. We all looked at him. He didn't look up from his coffee. It hasn't shifted the corridor in 6 days, he said. It shifted 3 times in the first week, twice in the second, once at the start of the third, and then nothing. That's not random variation. It's retreating, or consolidating, Fossa said, building pressure for a single shift rather than distributing it. Malo shrugged one shoulder. He didn't argue. He was probably right that the Seraph had been backing off, but neither of them could know it for certain, and the conversation had the texture of 2 people filling silence with analysis, because the alternative was sitting quietly with the fact that Orvek, Tan had died at the watch station in the forward observation deck, and that we were still inside the thing that had put us in this position. I reached into my breast pocket and put the folded paper on the table. Kahan unfolded it first, because she was closest and because that was who Kahan was by that point in the mission, the person who engaged the data before she engaged her. Reaction to it. She read it in silence for longer than it should have taken a person to read 4 panels of handwriting. Then she passed it to Malo without looking at him. Malo read it once, and then he read it again. Then he put it flat on the table and looked at it for a while, before sliding it toward Fossa. Fossa read it and set it down and turned it around so Yol could see it. Yol leaned forward and read it, and then sat back in his chair and stared at a spot on the table somewhere past the paper's edge. No one said anything for what I estimated at approximately 50 seconds. The water tanks cycled. The Seraph did its thing below the threshold of measurement. The paper was a watch rotation schedule. Tan had started it on day 8, when he'd taken over the forward watch, and it covered the full span from day 8 to day 32, the outer limit of our provision window. He'd mapped out every rotation, every 6-hour block, every crew assignment. He'd built the schedule assuming 5 active crew members. He'd already accounted for Yol's removal from frontline rotation by day 8, and then he'd been updating it every day, refolding it, carrying it in his hand or his pocket, or on the ledge of the watch console where he could reach it without looking up. The thing that made it what it was, the thing that put 5 people around a galley table in silence for nearly a minute, was visible the moment you knew what to look for. Every time a rotation had been high risk, the early morning hours when the Seraph's resonance tended to peak, the long middle watches when alertness dropped and anomaly response slowed, the stretches around the incidents that we'd flagged in the official logs with neutral clinical language that didn't come close to describing what they'd been like from the inside. Tan had assigned himself that block, not every dangerous shift, not ostentatiously. He hadn't gone through the schedule and highlighted his name in red. There was nothing on any of the 4 panels that announced what he was doing. If you didn't know the history of the 23 days, you would read the schedule as an ordinary rotation document, slightly idiosyncratic in its weighting, the kind of variation you'd expect from someone managing a reduced crew in a difficult environment. We'd been inside those 23 days. We knew what the early morning watch on day 11 had been. That was the morning we'd lost 90 seconds of hull integrity data during a Sareth resonance peak and had needed someone on the forward console who hold the sensor array steady through a partial blind period, without either freezing or making compensating inputs that would corrupt the log. It had required a particular kind of nerve. Not heroism, nothing dramatic, just the willingness to keep doing the right thing precisely while you couldn't verify that the right thing was working. Tan had taken that watch. We knew what the day 14's crisis block had been. That was when FOSA had identified a thermal anomaly in the drive housing that, if it had developed into a cascading failure, would have ended the mission in a different way than running out of provisions. Crisis block ran 6 hours, starting at hour 0 of the anomaly. While FOSA worked the drive housing and someone needed to hold the watch station continuously without relief. The logs show the anomaly was contained. What the logs don't show is that the watch station required a full uninterrupted 6-hour presence during that window. Tan had taken it. We knew what day 17 had been. We didn't talk about day 17, which is something survey crews do when something has happened that they've classified internally as too large to parse in the middle of a mission. The Sareth had done something on day 17 that had briefly registered on 2 independent sensor systems as a direct targeting acquisition. A reading that had lasted 4.2 seconds before dissolving back into the general resonance noise. Whether it was a targeting acquisition in any meaningful sense, whether the Sareth was capable of that kind of intentional action, whether it had been a test or a mistake or a sensor artifact, we had not been able to determine, and I'm not sure we ever will. What I know is that in the aftermath of those 4.2 seconds, the forward observation deck had required a continuous watch for 36 hours while Kahan analyzed the sensor data, and that 36 hours covered 3 rotation cycles, and that Tan had taken 2 of the 3, without volunteering or asking for anything in return. He'd just looked at the schedule, crossed off the 2 most exposed blocks and written his name in. The last entry was his own name, in the final slot of the final rotation on day 32, at hour 32 of that day. He'd given himself the last watch, the one that would have been, if we hadn't found our exit and the provisions had run out, the last rotation, before options ran out completely. He had written his own name at the end of a list that he'd designed as a funnel for everything the Sareth could throw at a survey crew in a failing ship, and then he'd carried that list in his fist for 15 days and said nothing to anyone. He knew, Malo said finally. His voice was level. He was looking at the paper the way you look at a horizon. I wasn't sure what exactly Tana had known, and I've been parsing that question for years since. He'd known the risks were real. You couldn't spend 3 weeks in the Pellucid Drift without knowing that. He'd known, I think, that the rotation couldn't be fully equalized, that in a reduced crew with uneven capability, someone was going to absorb more of the dangerous work than the others. And that, if that someone was going to be anyone, it should be a choice rather than an accident. He'd understood, in the specific practical way that he understood most things, that the schedule was also a kind of moral architecture. That how you distribute the dangerous hours is not a neutral act, that it expresses something about what you think the people around you are worth, and that if you have the ability to influence that distribution, you bear some responsibility for how it goes. He'd built the schedule the way he'd built it because that's the kind of person he was. He'd written himself last because that was the position he'd decided to take. Whether he'd known, in some deeper sense, that day 8 was the last time he'd make that kind of decision, I can't say. I think probably he'd just been doing the math and had liked the numbers where they landed. He knew, I agreed. Thought about that phrase for years. The way Malo said it. Not as an accusation, not as a eulogy, just as a statement of fact that had been waiting to be said. He knew. Two words that covered everything from Tana's competence to his character. 15 days of carrying the weight of a decision that no one else had been asked to make. What Tana had known, specifically, was the shape of the drift corridor's progression. He'd been paying attention. More attention, and of a different kind than the rest of us. Kahan had been documenting. Fossa had been maintaining. I had been managing. Malo had been watching, in that careful, focused way of his. Tan had been calculating. He'd been building a model of how the 26 days would go from the inside, in the position of someone who understood crew dynamics and physical systems in an integrated way that most specialists don't. He'd understood, by day 8, that the schedule was the load-bearing element of the mission, that everything else could degrade as long as the schedule held, and that the schedule would only hold if someone was willing to hold the dangerous parts of it. He understood that someone would need to have decided, before the pressure peaked, what they were going to do when it peaked. And he'd decided. He'd known something else, I think. He'd known that the kind of deciding he was doing was not the kind you announce. Not because announcing it would have been wrong, exactly, but because it would have changed it. It would have made it a conversation, a negotiation, something that existed in the space between people where it could be argued about and revised. What he'd built was not a proposal. It was a fact. He'd made it a fact by writing it down and folding it up. And then the only thing left was to be the person who had made that fact until he couldn't anymore. That's what he knew. He knew what he was doing, and he knew why he was doing it, and he knew that the only way it worked was keep it folded in his pocket. We buried him the way you bury people on a survey vessel in a compromised drift corridor. Said what we had to say over the mid-deck intercom, gathered in different parts of the ship because the forward section felt wrong to congregate. His body still in the observation deck. Then we suited up and went Eva through the mid-deck airlock and let him go into the pellucid drift on a clean trajectory that wouldn't intersect the Arvin mast's position for at least 200 years. The drift is full of light. Every survey crew I've talked to who has passed through it mentions the light when they're willing to talk about the drift at all. The way the particles in the corridor catch whatever the Sarith generates and refract it into something that isn't quite bioluminescence and isn't quite Asian bloom, but that the human eye reads as a deep, sourceless, encompassing glow. Coming through a port window or through a visor in Eva, it has a quality that I've heard described as beautiful, and have never used that word for myself, because beautiful implies enjoyment, and what it felt like to stand in it was more complex than enjoyment. It felt like being seen, not assessed, not measured, seen, in a neutral, very large, very old way that had nothing to do with whether it liked what it observed. Tan drifted out into it, and the glow took him in, and then we came back inside and sealed the airlock and stood in the mid-deck for a moment before anyone moved. I put the schedule back in my breast pocket. What came after that was 11 days. I could write them in detail. The crew logs cover every watch, every sensor reading, and every hour of the drive window analysis that Kahan was building, and the maintenance cycles that Fossa ran on the drive housing, while the rest of us held the rotation. But the shape of 11 days is simpler than their detail, and the shape is what matters. We held the watch. 4 people, reduced rotation. The early mornings going to Malo without any discussion, and without any acknowledgement of what that meant. He'd read the schedule. He knew which hours Tan had taken. On the morning of day 24, when the early morning rotation came around, Malo had simply gone to the watch station and sat down, and I'd understood what he was doing and not mentioned it. Mentioning it would have felt like diminishing what Tana had done and what Malo was doing both at once. Some things don't improve by being named. Y'all recovered partially by day 26. The Sarith's resonance had been dropping in small increments since day 22. Not dramatically, not the kind of drop you'd log as a significant event, but cumulatively enough that by day 26, Han's measurements showed the subsonic output had decreased by approximately 28% from its peak. That was enough to let y'all sleep in longer blocks, and eat in a way that had some appetite behind it. He came to the galley on day 26 and ate full meal at the table, instead of in the environmental compartment. Was the first time he'd done that in 9 days. And nobody made anything of it. Jane completed her drive window calculation on day 25 and presented it to the crew in the galley with a specificity that I found, even then, remarkable. She had modeled the corridor alignment on 16 different assumptions about the Sareth's resonance behavior and found that 14 of them produced a workable burn window on day 26, one produced it on day 29, and one produced no window within the provision's timeline. She presented all 16 scenarios. She presented the assumptions behind each one. She explained which assumptions she had the highest confidence in and which ones she'd flagged as uncertain. And then she said, "The window is day 26. We should take it." I asked if she was willing to stake her life on that analysis. She said she already was. We ran the burn on day 26 at hour 9. Fossa had the drive housing as ready as he could make it. He'd told me beforehand was about 91% of spec. Close enough that on a normal mission, it wouldn't have required a conversation, but we weren't on a normal mission, and he wanted me to know the number. I appreciated the number. I still appreciate it. 91% from a drive that had been sitting in a Sareth resonance field for 26 days was a significant engineering outcome, and I said so. And Fossa nodded once and went back to the housing. The burn worked. Partial exit. We were still in the outer gradient of the drift corridor, still within the Sareth's electromagnetic range, still not in a position to transmit beyond line of sight, but we'd broken the lock. We could sustain acceleration. We had momentum. And then, 4 hours later, the Sareth withdrew. I've described the withdrawal to a large number of people in the years since the Arvin mast incident, and I've never quite managed to describe it in a way that those people find satisfying, because what it felt like from the inside doesn't map cleanly onto any of the frameworks they're trying to fit it into. The survey board wants a mechanism. The entity behavior researchers want a behavioral model. Crew psychology people want an interpersonal narrative. What I can give them is a description of what happened, and then my interpretation. And the gap between the two is the thing that none of them have figured out how to close. What happened? The Sareth's electromagnetic output began declining at hour 0 of day 27, approximately 4 hours after our drive burn. The decline was not gradual in the way that a natural dissipation would be gradual. It was banded, like layers being removed one at a time. The communications array came back first. Then the navigation system began reconciling. Then the sensor interference cleared in sections, the way fog clears when the wind picks up from one direction. At hour 2, Cahan was able to begin transmitting our position and the mission-critical data she'd been compiling for 26 days. At hour 3, the hull stopped vibrating. Not reduced, not diminished, stopped. Fossa stood in the drive compartment with both palms flat on the inner hull for 30 seconds and then came to the forward observation deck and stood in the doorway and said, "It's gone." By hour 4, we were running clean. Every system within normal parameters. The pellucid drift's ambient light, still coming through the port side glass, still doing what it did. The thing that had been inside it, the presence, the weight, the frequency that had lived in our sternums for 26 days, was not there anymore. I've read the 17 theoretical explanations the survey board commissioned in the following year. Some of them are probably partially correct, in the way that all partial explanations of large things are partially correct. The drive burn had shifted our position in the corridor and may have changed the resonance geometry in ways that made continued occupation less interesting or less efficient for the Sareth. The cumulative time since our entry had exceeded the median engagement duration for entities of the Sareth's classification in the existing literature. The change in our crew biomass following Tana's death had altered measurable parameters that the Sareth may have been using to track us. I don't believe any of those explanations are complete. I believe they're all reaching for something they don't have a vocabulary for, and that the thing they're reaching for is sitting folded in my breast pocket. Here is what I believe. The Sareth had been in that corridor for longer than I can usefully conceptualize, and it had been watching us. specifically. Watching the way old things watch, the way something that has seen a very large number of things develop and resolve, watches the next thing develop. It had a model, it had, I think, a well-developed picture of what happens when 6 people are put in a closed corridor with an entity they can't communicate with and provisions that an end date and systems that won't hold indefinitely. It had probably seen that situation before, in variations. It knew how the sequences tended to go, and it had been waiting to see which version of the sequence we were. We had shown it something it hadn't seen before. Not the burn, not the navigation solution, not even the endurance of the watch itself, which was remarkable, but which is the kind of thing that intelligent species under extreme pressure sometimes manage to produce through the mechanism of having no other option. I think it was the schedule. I think it was the fact that on day 8, before things had become desperate, before the sequence had reached its critical phase, before anyone except Tane could see the full shape of what was coming, one of us had sat down and written himself into the most dangerous slots and put his own name last, and had folded that paper up and put it in his pocket and said nothing about it to anyone, and then had carried it for 15 days, and then had gone to the watch station on day 23 and died there, still holding it. The Sarith had watched civilizations develop and resolve. I believe it had a fairly precise model of what self-preservation looks like under extreme pressure. I believe it had a precise model of how resource scarcity affects the distribution of risk within a small group. I believe it had seen, a very large number of times, what happens to that distribution as the pressure increases, how it tends to move, and in which direction, and at whose expense. Tan had built a machine that moved the distribution in the wrong direction for the model. He'd built it quietly, on a piece of survey paper, in the situation that the model said should be pushing all distribution towards self-preservation, and he'd held it in his fist until he couldn't hold it anymore. I think the Sarith ran up against something that didn't fit its sequence. I think it needed 4 hours to determine whether it had observed what it thought it had observed. And then I think it withdrew. I'm not ascribing emotion to something I have no basis to describe. I'm not saying it was moved or impressed, or that it felt anything at all. I'm saying it encountered a data point that its existing model didn't account for, and that it chose, for whatever reason, to end the observation. We made exit from the drift corridor on day 28. Kahen's transmission had reached the relay station. A recovery vessel was en route. We rendezvoused with it 19 hours later, 5 people who had gone in as 6. The debrief took 6 days. A survey station medbay doubling as a classified review chamber, a rotating panel, and a lot of questions that circled the same subject from different angles. What had the Sarith been doing? What had it wanted? Why had it withdrawn? I answered honestly. I gave them the electromagnetic data and the frequency logs and Kahen's biometric documentation and the drive window calculation and Foss's hull resonance records. I gave them the timeline. I gave them everything I had that could be measured. At the end of the 3rd day, when the panel had finished with the portion of the debrief that lived inside measurement, I put the folded schedule on the table. The panel chair, a woman named Assessor Vrank, picked it up and read it. She was a methodical reader. She went through all 4 panels at the same deliberate pace, turned it over to check the back, found it blank, refolded it along its existing creases with a precision that suggested she'd handled documents that mattered before. She set it down between us. This was in the deceased crew member's hand at time of discovery, she said. Yes, you removed it from the body. I did, and you carried it for the remainder of the mission. Yes, she looked at it sitting on the table. You believe this document irrelevant to the Sarith's withdrawal. I said I believed it was the center of the whole thing, and that everything else, the burn, the timeline, the resonance drop, was the rest of the explanation trying to catch up to it. She was quiet for a moment. She was not a person who was visibly comfortable with explanations that her filing system couldn't categorize. She was intelligent enough to recognize when the filing system had run out of road. You understand, she said, that we cannot submit a formal finding attributing entity disengagement to a watch schedule. I understand that, I said. What we can submit, she said carefully, is a finding that attributes disengagement to a combination of drive corridor dynamics, decision-making under resource pressure, and a pattern of crew behavior that may have altered the entity's observation calculus in ways that warrant further study. That's accurate, I said. It's also what the crack in a rock formation looks like from outside the crack. She looked at me. The Sarith was watching to see what we'd do, I said. The behavior that warranted further study was that one of us had written himself last, and then kept showing up anyway. She picked up the schedule again. She held it for a moment, not reading it. Then she set it down. I'll log it as an artifact of potential analytical significance, she said. That's fine, I said. Log it however you need to. She looked at me once more before she moved on. I think she understood what I was saying. I think she'd understood it from the moment she read the paper. Understanding something and knowing how to file it are different problems, and hers was the second one. I kept the schedule. That probably shouldn't appear in any formal account, but it's true, and the thing about 28 days in the pellucid drift is that you come out of it with a reduced tolerance for leaving true things out of the account. Assessor Vrank didn't ask for it back. I didn't offer it. It sits in the same breast pocket now that it sat in when Tana's fingers were still warm enough to move. I have been in contact with the other 4 survivors in the years since the incident. Malo left survey work and now runs a water reclamation facility on an outer settlement, which is exactly the kind of work I'd have predicted for him. Essential, technical, unspectacular, requiring the specific kind of sustained attention that has nothing to prove. He sent me a message on the 2nd anniversary of the incident. Just one line. Do you still have it? I wrote back. Yes. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Some questions are just a way of making sure a thing is still real. Kehen published 3 papers on the Sarith's electromagnetic behavior in the 2 years following the mission. The third one, which covers the withdrawal phase, contains in its final paragraph a sentence that I've read many times. The data does not fully account for the entity's disengagement, and the authors submit that the gap in the model may be addressed by variables not fully indexed in standard entity contact analysis frameworks. That's the most that academic language could get her toward what she actually believed, which she told me directly over a meal at the survey station during the debrief. That the schedule was the thing, and that, whatever the Sarith was, it had read the situation correctly, and it had found something it didn't have a prior example for, and it had left. Fossa went back to fieldwork 6 months after the incident. He told me he'd considered stopping, and had decided that not going back would mean the Arvin mast had cost him more than it had cost Tan, and that he wasn't willing to accept that accounting. I thought that was right. I still think that was right. Yol recovered fully within a year of returning to stable ground. He's doing liaison work now, which suits him. The resonance damage healed more cleanly than any of us had expected, and he said once, when I ran into him at a survey station on the inner circuit, that the 28 days had done something clarifying that he couldn't quite name, but that had made him better at his work. I believed him. I've seen it before, in people who've been under that kind of pressure and come out the other side intact. There's a calibration that happens, a settling of what matters into its correct proportion. Sariths had given us all a very precise education in proportion. There is a line in one of the older consortium crew manuals, pre-unification ones printed on paper, that you can still find in archive reading rooms on the long-established stations, that I've thought about more than once in the years since the Arvin mast. It's in the chapter on extended mission psychology, and it reads, crew is not the sum of its members. It is the shape of what they decide to carry for each other. Tan never read that manual. I'm certain of it. He didn't read that kind of thing. He read specifications, technical documents, whatever he needed to read to do the job he was doing, and then he put it down. He was not sentimental, and he was not, in the ordinary sense, expressive. He expressed himself in survey pencil, in small handwriting, on folded mission paper, put the result in his pocket, and went to the watch station. The Sarith was old enough that it may have watched a very large number of intelligent species arrive in that corridor, with purposes and schedules and provisions and systems, and had watched them wear down under the resonance, and the interference, and the narrowing options, and had learned to wait, things that old are entitled to their conclusions. It had probably earned the conviction That what was in the corridor would eventually run out, the way everything runs out, the way cracks seal or widen, the way formations split. I think about what it must have been, not felt. I won't use that word. What it must have registered when Tana carried the schedule for 15 days. When he took the early watch on day 11 and the crisis block on day 14 and the dark hours after day 17 and the long middle watch on day 21 and did not say a word about any of it. When he showed up at the watch station, in the glow of the pellucid drift coming through side glass, with the schedule folded in his pocket and the dangerous slots crossed off above his name, and sat down and did the watch. And then came back and did it again, and again. And then I think about the Sareth having to revise its model. I don't know what the Sareth is. I don't know what it experiences. If experience is a word that applies. I know it withdrew. And I know that Orvec Tan had his own name at the bottom of that list, in the last slot, at hour 32, by deliberate choice, and that he carried it in his fist until his heart gave out, and that when I opened his hand, pellucid drift's light was catching the corner of the paper between his thumb and first finger. I took it. I have been holding it since. That seems right to me. That seems like the correct answer to a question that survey boards are still trying to figure out how to file. You hold what someone passes to you when they've decided you should have it. You carry it through whatever comes next. You try to deserve it. Tan never made it to hour 32, but the corridor is clear now, and all 5 of us walked out. I've been asked in the years since whether I think the Sareth understood what Tan's schedule was. Not metaphorically, literally. Whether it perceived the paper or the handwriting, the specific pattern of names and hours. Whether there was a mechanism by which a distributed electromagnetic entity could read blue survey pencil on folded mission paper and draw conclusions from it. My answer is always, I don't know, and that's not the question. The question is what the Sareth observed across the 15 days that Tana carried the schedule. Whether it read the paper or not, it was watching. It had been watching the entire time. It had access to every sensor reading we generated, every biometric output, every energy expenditure logged by every watch station on the Arvin mast. It had, in the fullest possible sense, more data about our 26 days in that corridor than we did ourselves, because we'd been experiencing it from the inside, and it had been observing it from all sides simultaneously. What that data showed, if you followed it correctly, was a pattern. A single crew member taking the high-risk rotation blocks at a rate that could not be explained by random distribution or by capability assessment. A single crew member showing up consistently for the moments when showing up cost the most. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that announced itself or called attention to itself. In the ordinary, undramatic way that the most important things tend to happen. By being done, without comment, repeatedly, until it couldn't be done anymore. The Sareth had been in that corridor for an immeasurable time. It had watched, presumably, a very large number of crews in a very large number of situations. Some of them had probably performed extraordinary acts under pressure, acts of courage or sacrifice or technical brilliance that would have been easy to identify and categorize and file under the correct heading in whatever taxonomy it used to organize what it observed. Those are the kinds of things that register sharply. They have a beginning and an end. They're legible. Tana had done was not legible in that way. It didn't have a moment. It had 15 days of undramatic, incremental, completely voluntarily sustained choice, accumulated in blue survey pencil on a piece of folded paper that no one else had known existed until I opened a dead man's hand. There was no announcement. There was no sacrifice in the fire. There was a schedule and a pocket and 15 days of showing up. I think that's the thing the Sareth didn't have a prior example for. Not the heroism, I think it had seen heroism. Not the sacrifice, I think it had seen sacrifice. The thing it didn't have an example for was the 15 days. The choosing, before it became necessary, to be the one who absorbs what needs absorbing. The carrying of that choice in your pocket, in your own handwriting, without telling anyone, and then going to the watch station and doing it. There's a kind of endurance that runs on adrenaline and visibility. It's real, and it matters, and it has sustained people through things that should have broken them. But there's another kind that runs on something quieter, and I'm not sure I have the right word for it. resolution maybe, or commitment in the specific sense of having committed a thing, having put it, somewhere it can't be taken back from. Tan had committed himself to the last slot on day 8, and then he'd lived inside that commitment for 15 days and never renegotiated it. Sareth had been watching for an answer to the question of what we would do. I think it had assumed, reasonably, based on extensive prior observation, that the answer would be what the answer usually is, that the risk would distribute unevenly toward the margins, toward whoever had the least ability to resist it, and that the sequence would resolve accordingly. It had gotten a different answer. I've thought, more than once, about what that's like. To be something that old with that much data, and to get a different answer than you expected. Whether the Sareth experience is anything that I'd recognize as surprise, or interest, the particular quality of attention that you give to something you've never seen before, I can't say. But I know it withdrew. And I know what was in the corridor when it did. The Palooza Drift has been formally closed to survey traffic since 18 months after the Arvin masts incident. The consortium is doing studies. They're building better instruments. They're working on communication protocols, on the theory that if the Sareth is as old and as observant as the data suggests, it might eventually be willing to engage with something other than passive presence. I think they're right to try. I think the Sareth is worth understanding, and I think the people working on that problem are doing important work. I also think they should read Cahan's third paper very carefully, particularly the final paragraph. Take seriously the implication that the gap in the model might not be addressable through better instruments alone. The gap in the model is not a sensor problem. I still have the schedule. I've had it for long enough now that the paper has softened along the fold lines. Not deteriorating. The survey pencil and the paper stock are both built for long-term field conditions, but softened in the way that things soften when they've been folded and unfolded. Many times by hands, that meant something by the handling. Tan's handwriting is still legible. I can read every name. I can read his own name at the bottom of the last panel, in the same size and weight as all the other names, written with the same unhurried precision that he brought to everything he did. 7 names. He was last. There are things you carry because you need to remember them, sealant, and there are things you carry because putting them down would mean something about you that you're not willing to accept. I've thought about which category this falls into, and I've decided it's neither. Carry it, because Tan put it in a position to be found, and I found it, and it's mine now. And because some things are correctly held, rather than filed or framed or explained. Because the explanation is in the carrying, and the carrying is the explanation. And the rest is just the rest of the explanation, trying to catch up. He gave himself the last watch. He kept every watch before it. That's the whole account.